All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM Daf Samach. We started the Sugya by learning the Mishnah and Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis regarding a Pesach, a carbon Pesach that was shechted. And here are the words, Lishmoi, Shaloi Lishmoi. And as we reviewed the first Mishnah in Zajac, the Mishnah there is speaking about offering a carbon Lishmoi and Shaloi Lishmoi, and that really has two meanings. The first meaning that we are focusing right now is Shinui Kodesh. Shinui Kodesh means that when you bring a carbon, either, the Gemara says in Zajac, bring it stam and you're good. But if you are having a clear machshav of what this carbon is, so let's say the carbon is a carbon shlamim, so then you have to shecht it l'shem shlamim. If you shecht a shlamim l'shem chatos, let's say, if you shecht a shlamim l'shem another carbon, l'shem oila, so as we mentioned, the general rule is that it won't be counted, it won't be credited to its owner, that's for sure. However, at least the carbon will be kosher, which means that avodah may be continued with that carbon. However, when it comes to a Pesach, when it comes to a chatos, the Mishnah says that if the kohen, during any one of the four steps of the avodah, which is shchita, kabbalah, hiloch, and zrika, if he has a machsheves shaloi lishmoi, shinui kodesh, he had in mind that this is for anything other than the Pesach, that completely invalidates the carbon. That's step number one. Important to point out that there is a machlokes between the Rishonim. In the beginning of Zvachim, Rashi and Tosfos are in the same side of this argument, and they say that whenever we're going to be speaking about machsheves shaloi l'shmoi, the intent of a shinui kodesh, that must be verbalized. If the kohen only has that in his mind, then he owns up to it, and he says, listen, when I shechted this carbon, I had in mind another carbon. It will not invalidate the carbon. So holds Rashi, so holds Tosfos. On the other side of this argument, you have the Rambam and others that say no, that Chazal uses the words machshava. Machsheves shaloi lishmoi. Even only a machshava has the koyach by kachim to bring about this type of invalidation. Final quick word of introduction is that we're going to get to this in our sugya and PESACHIM, that even though we are beginning to focus on the lishmoi or the shaloi lishmoi only as it relates to shinui kodesh, having in mind for the carbon that it is, or having in mind for another carbon, that's called in English a change of holiness. You may not make a change in holiness. There is another machshava that can also invalidate the carbon, and that is called shinui ba'alim. So if Reuven is the one that is offering the carbon, and the kohen has in mind he's bringing this for Shimon, that means he has a intent or a verbalized intent. That is a change of ownership that also will invalidate the carbon. But coming back over here, where you're learning about a machsheves shinui kodesh, and what the Mishnah did is that it added a nuance, that even if there were two machshavos, lishmoi, shaloi lishmoi, or the opposite, shaloi lishmoi and lishmoi, that also the Mishnah says will invalidate the Pesach. And we're going to spend the first Amid plus clarifying exactly what is the case when the Mishnah speaks about this dual intent. Is it a dual intent that during one of the four steps, shchita, kabbalah, hiloch, and zrika, he had a machshava lishmoi, and during another one of these four steps, he had a machshava shaloi lishmoi? In other words, these two intentions happen by two avodas in any order, the lishmoi first or the shaloi lishmoi first, or is the Mishnah's halacha that a dual intent invalidates the carbon Pesach is even if he had that dual intent during the same avodah. So the kohen is shechting the carbon and he's saying, I'm shechting this carbon l'shem Pesach or l'shem shlamim, or l'shem shlamim or l'shem Pesach. And this is going to link us into a machlokes that we have throughout Shas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, whether we say tfois loshen rishon or whether we say af bigmar devarav adam nispas. Now the ground zero that Rashi quotes for this case, even though we have this machlokes really three different times, is going to be a case in Tumura. And we just learned this a few daf ago, that there is a koyach that someone has to take an animal that's choil and to have in front of him an animal that's already designated with the kedusha. So you have, let's say, an oila, and a person can say that this animal that's choil should substitute the animal that's an oila, even though the person should not make such a declaration. However, if a person made this declaration, the Torah says, "V'hayahu utmurasi kodesh." The animal that was an oila remains an oila, but this choil animal also becomes imbued with the kedusha of the one for which it was tmurad for. Question is, if you have in front of you three animals, an oila and a shlamim, and now your animal that's choil, and you don't say zu tmuras oila, you didn't say zu tmuras shlamim, you made two statements. Zu should be tmuras oila, tmuras shlamim. Rav Meir says whenever a person makes two statements and they don't come together, you only follow the first statement. The second is halachically not recognized. Rabbi Yossi says that in this scenario, we take into account both of the statements. The person really wanted to make them together, just we can't say two words together. Af b'gemar dvar of adam nispas. And in the case of Tumura, what Rabbi Yossi suggests, which is the classical case that we have in Kachim, is that this animal taka has in it kedushas oila and kedushas shlamim. So what are you going to do? So yira ache yistoev, as Chazal say, you let the animal pasture, because any animal that has in it kedushas haguf cannot be redeemed. That the kabayis can be redeemed. Kedushas haguf has to go on the mizbeach. Once it becomes blemished, now you redeem it, and with its money, half of it goes for the purchase of a new oil, and the other half goes for a shlamim. Af bigmar dvarav adam nispas. I want people to know that it's not so pashut what Rabbi Yossi holds. I mean, what we gave the intro to Chap, the whole first Amid today, but really, there are times that Rabbi Yossi says that we only follow the second statement. That will not align with our entire sugya. And as Tosfos and other Rishonim point out, that Rabbi Yossi holds like this. When a person makes a dual statement, and we could interpret the latter part, the second statement, as a interpretation of the first statement, as a clarification of the first statement, there Rabbi Yossi holds you only follow the second statement. That's called Tfais Lashon Achrein. But when a person makes two statements, like in the case of Tumura, Tmuras Oila, Tmuras Shlamim, Tmuras Shlamim is not clarifying Tmuras Oila. It's either or. Says Rabbi Yossi, he meant both. And that's going to be the case over here. The person says, the Kohen is saying, I'm shechting this carbon, l'shem Pesach, l'shem Shlamim. What are you clarifying? It's either a Pesach or a Shlamim. It means both. Af bigmar dvarav adam nispas. That's going to be the sugya over here. We're going to, throughout this, learn other types of machshavos that could potentially invalidate the Pesach. And this is really connected to a Mishnah we're going to learn on Daf Samach Aleph. And that is that when you shech the carbon, you have to shech it for people that could eat at least a kazayas. Excluding if you have a person that's ill, God forbid. And right now they can't eat a lot. Or an elderly person. When they eat very little. If you shech the carbon Pesach, only for people that cannot eat a kazayas, even though it's for many of them, they will finish the carbon by midnight, but each individual, none of them can eat a kazayas, the carbon is invalidated. Interestingly, when it comes to the machshava of eating it, if you have a group of people, some are healthy, some can eat a kazayas, plus some cannot, since you also intended for those who can eat it, this machshava will not invalidate it. Not like we're learning now that when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, if you have dual intent, some good, some not good, it becomes invalid. By machshavas consumption, good and not good is okay. There's another thing that you have to shech the carbon for people that pre-registered on the carbon. If someone was not pre-registered on the carbon, then you can't shech the carbon Pesach for them. Carbon Pesach has to be slaughtered to people that have a bris milah. People that don't have a bris milah, even according to Rashi, people who don't have a bris milah because the Torah says they should not have it. For example, if you have a person whose two older brothers were born, the parents gave them a bris milah, and they bled to death. Here we follow the shita that after twice we have a chazaka, and the third child may not be circumcised. How we apply this today halachically is not so simple. Today, medicine thing got evolved. And if a doctor is going to say that whatever it is that happened to the prior two is not connected to the third, then the third child does have to have a bris milah. But there are cases where halachically a person does not have to be circumcised, yet kachim, this person may not eat. And that includes a carbon Pesach. So when you have a machshava lamulin, the group, some of them are circumcised and some of them are arelim, that will invalidate the carbon. And finally, which will be connected to Samach Hamid Beis, it's a short daf, but this is so packed with many klalim that we learned in Kachim, and that is as follows. Our carbon Pesach, the mitzvah of carbon Pesach, as we are learning, is to be offered on the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon. Really, ideally, after the Talmud Shel Bein Ha'arbayim. By the way, we will be learning, we're going to unpackage this over the next few daf, that if the carbon Pesach was shechted and fully offered before the Talmud Shel Bein Ha'arbayim, as long as it was done in the afternoon of the 14th, it's good. But what happens if a carbon Pesach is brought in any other time of the year? You know what happens? It's amazing. If the kohen who brought it lishmai for the carbon Pesach, it's invalid because the carbon Pesach should only be brought on the 14th in the afternoon. If the kohen had a machshava, shaloi lishmai, shlamim, specifically shlamim, that carbon will be good. Amazing. When you shecht a carbon Pesach, shaloi bizmanoi, machsheves shaloi lishmai validates the carbon. And based on that premise, we're going to have a whole Amud Beis, the Gevaldike inquiries. Okay, Chevra, I know it's a long intro, but we really spoke out the daf. We're going to go to daf Nun Tes Amud Beis in the beginning of the Gemara. And the Mishnah began speaking about the 4 steps. The Mishnah began by telling you that a machsheves shini kodesh invalidates the Pesach. But then the Mishnah gave 2 cases. First was, if you had in mind lishmai vishaloi lishmai, or if you had in mind shaloi lishmai ulishmai, dual intent of Shinoi Kodesh, L'Shem Pesach, L'Shem Shlamim, or L'Shem Shlamim, L'Shem Pesach, the Mishnah said it's possible. And on that, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines on the bottom of the beginning of the Gemara, Rav Papa inquires, this dual intent, was that Ba'avoida Achas Tanan, during Shechita itself, the Kohen says, I'm shechting this L'Shem Shlamim, L'Shem Pesach, or L'Shem Pesach, L'Shem Shlamim, or is the Mishnah referring to B'shtei Avodas Tanan? The dual intent was 1/10 during one of those 4 steps. And the Gemara explains the inquiry, if the Mishnah is speaking about Avoida Achas Tanan, if that would be the case, or if that would also be the case of the Mishnah, then the Mishnah cannot go according to Rav Meir. The Mishnah will be only in Rabbi Yossi. Then Rabbi Yossi, the Amar Af Bigmar Dvarav Adam Nispas. And the Gemara explains itself because if the Mishnah would also be authored by Rabbi Meir and Rav Meir, like we spoke on our intro, in the case of a person saying, Hadezu Tmura Shlamim, Hadezu Tmuras Oila, Tmura Shlamim, Tmuras Oila, Tmura Shlamim. Rav Meir says it's only Tmuras Oila. In other words, that when a person makes a dual statement, the first statement is what counts. The subsequent, the second statement is not b'chlal reckoned with. So in the case in the Mishnah where the person had a machsheves lishmai, shaloi lishmai, if it is during one avodah, according to Rav Meir, the Pesach is going to be kosher. The first intent lishmai is what counts. The second one, which contradicts the first one, is not reckoned with. So if the Mishnah is b'avodah achas, then our Mishnah will only be Rav Meir. Only be Rabbi Yossi, because according to Rav Meir, twice Lashon Nisha, the carbon is going to be good. Daf Samach, or Dilma, maybe the Mishnah is only referring to Shtei Avodas Tanan. And then our Mishnah will also be able to go according to Rabbi Meir. Rav Meir says twice Lashon Nisha, and Hanami. However, Hanami Avodah Achas. But even Rav Meir will be Moida that when it comes to the 2 Avodas, any one of the Shechita Kabbalah Haylacha, Haylacha Zrika, Shechita Haylacha, Shechita Zrika, I don't care which 2. So then each one is avoida for itself, and even Ameir will be moida that each machshava is taken into account, and therefore, even though part was good, but since the other step was not good, the mitzal. Okay, so that's the boy. The boy of Rav Papa is our Mishnah avoida achas. Only Rabbi Yossi is our Mishnah only b'shtei avodos, and therefore our Mishnah can go even according to Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara further clarifies the inquiry of Rav Papa. Says the Gemara, Amri Ahaya, exactly on what case? Now we have 2 cases. Both of them is of dual intent, but the first one was lishmai v'shaloi lishmai, and the second was shaloi lishmai ulishmai. So the Gemara clarifies. Nema that the boy of Rav Papa goes on the case of first there was shaloi lishmai, and then lishmai. No. Guys, because Rav Meir holds twice Lashon Rishon. That can go according to Rav Meir even b'avoda achas, right? Because the first intent was already not good. The Mishnah will work because since the first intent was shaloi l'shmoi, if salei mikamaisa, that's even according to Rav Meir that says only twice lashon nishain. What about Rabbi Yossi? What about Rabbi Yossi? So here is the Gemara is really alluding to what we spoke on in the intro. There are certain cases where Rabbi Yossi says you only look at the lashon achra. And like we explained, whenever the two statements do not contradict each other, but you can actually understand the second statement to be a mafarish for the first statement, then you only focus on the second. But that's not the case over here, which in any order, it's either Pesach or Shlamim. One doesn't explain the other. When one doesn't explain the other, Rabbi Yossi holds you take both into account, not only the second statement. Af bigmar devar of adam nispas. You have to underline the word af. Islay. In other words, since you also take into account the first statement, according to Rabbi Yossi, when the first statement was not good, shaloi l'shmai or l'shmai, then that goes according to both Tanoim, no matter what, no matter when. The inquiry of Rav Papa was on the first case of dual intent in the Mishnah, and the first case was when the first of the dual intent was good. Ella al l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai. And here Rav Papa is saying that if this is also referring to the same avodah, if that's the case of the Mishnah, then our Mishnah will not be Rav Meir. So that's the question of Rav Papa, and on that we say, "Mai." Says the Gemara Tashema. We're going to try to resolve this inquiry from learning our Mishnah. It says in our Mishnah in the beginning, Shechita was already done. The Kohen says, "I'm doing this l'shem shlamim." And then the Mishnah continues, Vikibel, Vihalach, Vizarak, Shaloi Lishmai. Now, normally the letter Vav means and, not or, normally. So the Mishnah is saying the Shechita was already done bad, and then everything else was also done bad. So it says the Gemara, Hey, that can't be the meaning of the Mishnah. Because if you were to translate it literally, that the Vav before the word Kibel, the Vav before the word Vahalach, the Vav means and, we don't even need that. The Mishnah is not adding anything. To invalidate a carbon Pesach, bim machshavas, shaloi l'shmoi, you don't need for that not good machshava to happen during every one of the four steps. We know that. Even if you had a machshava shaloi l'shmoi during any one of the four, the carbon is invalidated. And if the Mishnah is beginning with telling you that the Kohen had this machshava during the Shechita, boom, the carbon is not good. Mikamaisa ifsalei. So therefore, here you're going to have to touch the vav, not and, but or, which means the beginning of the Mishnah shtei avodas. This is beautiful. If the beginning of the Mishnah shtei avodas, so what is the Mishnah adding by giving you the dual intent? If the dual intent is vaited b'shtei avodas, it's just the same exact case. Beautiful proof. Inami or no, the Shechita was good. Elama, the next step was not good, or the next steps were not good. Or Shachtoi the Kibav Alach L'Shmai. The first three steps were L'Shmai, but then the final step was Shaloi L'Shmai. The Mishnah already began speaking about Shtei Avodos, and the Mishnah is telling you the Havel or Shtei Avodos and the carbon is invalidated. So now that the Mishnah is continuing, Ema Seifa, Lishmai, Vishalai Lishmai, and that is the case of the inquiry as we spoke out, Hechidami, what are you telling me? That Inami B'Shtei Avodos, if the Mishnah is only speaking about the Shtei Avodos, then you mamish have a repeat. Hainu Reisha. Beautiful. Elolav, that when the Mishnah goes on by saying Lishmai V'Shalai Lishmai, it must be B'Avoda Achas. And therefore, our Mishnah is only Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yossi, the Amar Af Bigmar Devar of Adam Nispas, like we explained, because according to Rav Meir, when a person has dual intent, here in dual statements, according to Rashi and to Tosfos, we only follow the first, Tfais Lashon Nisha, and the second one is not reckoned with, then the Pesach would have been good. Lishmai, Ushalai Lishmai. Says the Gemara, no, it's not a proof. Maybe, La'olam, maybe again. Rishtei Avodas. V'reisha. Now listen to this nuance. And a lot of this daf and next daf will be based on what we're saying right now. The Reisha is speaking about classical, simple to avodas. When the carbon did the shechita, He was saying, I'm doing the shchita l'shem l'shmoi, l'shem Pesach. Then when he did the zrika, he says, I'm doing the zrika l'shem shlamim. That's not good. So if during any one of the four steps, if he had a machshava shaloi l'shmoi, but what's the pshat machshava shaloi l'shmoi? That he was thinking about that which he is doing now. When he's shechting, he's saying, I'm shechting l'shem l'shmoi shaloi l'shmoi. And every step the same. That's the reisha. Seifa, the dual intent, l'shmoi v'shaloi l'shmoi, or shaloi l'shmoi l'shmoi. Listen to this. The kohen is shechting. And he's saying during shechita, I'm shechting this for, let's say, l'shmoi u'shaloi l'shmoi. I'm shechting this l'shem Pesach. And then he makes a declaration during the shechita about what he will do during the zrika. And then he says that when I'll do the zrika I'm going to do for shlamim. Gewaldig. The kochashiv bizrika. What's the kochashiv bizrika? He's declaring an intent about what he'll do later. Explains the Gemara. The Amar, he says, Haren yishachar Pesach l'shmoi. The shechita I'm doing for the Pesach. But lizrek damai shaloi l'shmoi. But when I'm going to be doing the zrika, I will be doing it then for a shlamim. And just Baruch, this clearly, you spoke out yesterday, and we mentioned, how can a kohen, this is clearly not a kohen who's making a mistake. He's shechting, he's doing it intentionally. He's shechting it for a Pesach. That means he knows it's a Pesach. And he's saying, oh, but I'm going to be throwing the blood, I'm going to be doing it l'shem shlamim. We say that since Kahanim Zerizin, they don't make mistakes that quick. But he invalidates the korban. And now, what's the novelty of the second case of the Mishnah? That umachashvin ma'avoida la'avoida. B'chlal, this whole concept that when I'm doing one step and I'm declaring what I will have in mind when I do the second step, is that b'chlal counted? Now, really, we have in the Masechta Zavachim another inquiry of Rav Papa, whether it's counted or not. So now says the Gemara, there are two ways of learning our Mishnah. And one of the inquiries of Rav Papa will stand. If you're going to learn Pshat the way we attempted in the Havamina, that even during the same Avoida, he had a Machshavas L'shmoi, Shchita L'shmoi, Ushchita L'shem Shlamim, if that's the Pshat of our Mishnah, then could you have an intent from one Avoida to the other? We don't know. So then the Boya in Zavachim will stand, but then our Mishnah, if it's Bavoida Achas, will Takim not go according to Rav Meir. But there's another option. The other option is that our Mishnah is speaking about someone who has a machshava during one Avoida. During that Avoida, he's saying, I'm shechting it l'shem Pesach, but I will be doing the zrika l'shem shlamim. I will be doing the zrika l'shem shlamim. Now, what will be the sheet of the Mishnah if he were to have the machshava? Dual machshavas during the same avoida, for the same avoida, that's the boy of Rav Papa. We don't know. But if the case of the Mishnah will be that he's having a machshava during shchita, for shchita, and then he's having a machshava during shchita of what he will do when he does the zrika, that when I'll do the zrika, I'll do it l'shem shlamim. If that is the case of our Mishnah, then at least this will resolve the inquiry of Rav Papa's boya in Zavachim and Vahainu boya the Rav Papa. But again, we don't know what the pshat in the Mishnah is. We don't know what the case of the Mishnah is. So we're back to the boyim. So Tashema, another attempted proof, it says right in the Mishnah, Oy shaloi l'shmai u'l'shmai, like this dual intent, the Mishnah gave two cases. First, l'shmai u'shaloi l'shmai, and then the next case, which is shaloi l'shmai u'l'shmai. So here again, asks the Gemara, Hechi dami, if it's taka b'shtei avodos, which is what we would have to say in order to allow our Mishnah to follow even Rabbi Meir. Hashda, then the whole thing is not needed. It's not needed. Because if the first intent, which is good, but yet the second intent, b'shtei avodos, in the next avodah, invalidates it. So if you begin with a bad machshava, and then during the next step, ulishmai, of course it's invalidated. It's mamash taka not needed. But 1 second, so how do we resolve that question? Ella, the answer will be, is that the Mishnah is speaking about b'avoida achas. That will be the novelty of the second case, that during one avoida, The same avodah, shaloi l'shmai, u'l'shmai. And what's the chiddush? That will clarify umi the seifa b'avodah achas, nereshanami b'avodah. Notes if the Mishnah only would have written l'shmai, shaloi l'shmai, we erroneously would have thought the Mishnah speaking about shtei avodas. That's why the Mishnah gave another case, shaloi l'shmai u'l'shmai. So you're going to ask who needs that case? The chiddush is that it was during the same avodah, and therefore you might think that the second one resolves the first, because at least the same avodah also had a good intent. So there's a chiddush, no, it's also possible. But now we established the Mishnah speaking about the avodah achas. So again, l'chayra, our Mishnah is not Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara says, why? Perhaps l'oilam b'shtei avodas. Because during one avodah, according to Rabbi Meir, when you have the first machshava that's good, the carbon will be good. Indeed, it's not needed. Then it's very common for the Mishnah to be symmetric, for the Mishnah to repeat itself on both sides of the coin, even though one is already understood from the other. So again, we don't know. So again, there's no raya. So we're back to the bay. Tashema. Now that the Gemara cannot prove it from our Mishnah, now we're going to the Mishnah next daf, based on the premise that it's one flow of Mishnayos, and the case that we'll have in the next Mishnah will also clarify the case we have on our Mishnah. What does it say in the Mishnah on daf samach aleph? That shechotesh leila achlav, if the machshava is not shinui kodesh, it's another invalidated machshava, and that is I'm shechting it. The Kohen says, for those who cannot eat it. We're speaking about people that physically cannot eat in one sitting a kezayis. They're old or they're ill. Or shaloi l'menuyav, he shechted it for people that were not pre-registered to eat that lamb. Or he shechted it la'arelim, which may not eat kachim, may not eat carbon pesach, or vilatameim. Now I know tummy people can never eat kachim. Just we're going to learn that later. When we shech the carbon pesach betuma, that's the avoida part. A tummy person cannot eat kachim, so says the Mishnah apostle. Now that Mishnah is speaking about one intent. So of course it's speaking about one avoida. It can't be speaking about two avoidas because there aren't even two intentions. So here says the Gemara hachib shita b'avoida achasi. So umi the sefer avoida achas. That's the next Mishnah. So doesn't that imply? Can we not infer that our Mishnah reishanam b'avoida achas? The Gemara says that's not a proof. What kind of raya is that? Yes, the Seifa, which means the Mishnah daf samach aleph, clearly is b'avoida achas, but maybe our Mishnah reisha can be either b'avoida achas, and if that would be the case, then our Mishnah would only be Rabbi Yosi, or b'shtei avodos. So we're back to the boy. So weiter, let's continue to read the Mishnah daf samach aleph. Tashema, it says weiter in the Mishnah next daf. But if a kohen had a dual intent, the intentions that we're speaking about on daf samach aleph, which is lo oichlav, vishalei lo oichlav, there's a group of people. Some of them can eat the kazai, some of them cannot. And the kohen is saying, I'm shechting this for both, for the whole group, or kosher, period. Now says the Gemara, hey chidami, what's the case of the Mishnah? What's that case? Inami, that it is b'shtei avodos. B'shtei avodos. Now, what's b'shtei avodos, guys? We already clarified it. B'shtei avodos doesn't mean that when he did the shchita, he had in mind for people who can eat it. And then when he did the zrika, he had in mind shaloi lo ichlav. No, it's more than that. It's better than that. That b'shtei avodos means he shechted it. He says, I'm shechting it for those who can eat it. And when I will sprinkle the blood, he's making that declaration during the shchita. But he's speaking about that later when I'll do the next step, I will do that for those who cannot eat it. If that is the case, so says the Gemara, the time the chashiv bizrika, and now we'll understand why taka is the carbon not valid. Why is it kosher? He had dual intent. Because he linked the shaloi la'achlav in the zrika part. And very interestingly, I'm going to learn reasons for that later. The ein machsheves oichlin bezrika. That's a klal. When we began the sugya of you need to have the right machshava, emes, in our Mishnah, shinui kodesh, if you have a machsheves shinui kodesh during any one of the four steps, the carbon is possible. But when it comes to this machshava is that I'm shechting it for people who cannot eat it. That machshava for people who cannot eat is only a invalidating machshava if you had that during the shechita regarding the shechita. If you had that machshava when you did the shechita about what you will do the zrika for, or when you actually do the zrika and you say, I'm doing the zrika for those who can't eat it, we don't care. That's a klal. The ein machsheves oichlin bizrika. Gemaldik. And like Rashi proves it, just quickly, what's the logic behind that? The Rashi, 4 lines from the bottom, ein machsheves pasul psul ha'oichlin kudain choyle v'zaka misalas bizrika, because it's only regarding the shechita where it says lefi ochloi tachaysu. When the Torah says you have to shecht it, Rashi teaches the word tachaysu means you shecht it for those who can eat it. So the Torah demands of us the machsheves oichlen only by the shechita back inside the Gemara. So then again, if it's b'shtei avodos, which would imply ba'avoda achas. What's the avoda achas? That he's shechting it for those who could eat it, and he's shechting it for those who cannot eat it. What? Keep going, b'shchita. That we're going to say that since he also had a machshava that shaloi la'achlav, it will invalidate it. That's also not true. And therefore it's possible, even though he had an intention, I'm shechting it for those who could eat, and I'm shechting it for those who can eat. If that's the pshat in the Mishnah, that's not true. Because we have a cardinal rule, guys. This is a very important rule. That vaha, the last line of the Amid, kaimalon, mixas oichlin loy pasla. As long as some people in the group are able to eat a kazayas in one sitting of eating, clearly it doesn't bother us if in the group there are also others who cannot eat it. So you cannot say that the Seifa of the Mishnah later on Daf Samach Aleph is speaking about Shtei Avodos, because then the inference, if it's only Shtei Avodos, then the inference is going to lead you to a wrong conclusion. You have to appreciate the contrast. In our Mishnah, dual machshava invalidates l'shmoi u'shaloi l'shmoi, or shaloi l'shmoi l'shmoi pasal. The Mishnah Samach Aleph says lo'oichlav shaloi lo'oichlav shaloi lo'oichlav is kosher. Question is, why is it kosher? If you're going to learn the Mishnah's only b'shtei avodos, which would make you understand that if it was ba'avoda achas, it's possible, it's not true. The din that it's kosher has to be also daf samach amud beis elolav ba'avoda achas. Beautifully, Rashi adds the word af. The Mishnah must be speaking about even if it's ba'avoda achas, because both are true. What we learned on Amud Aleph is true. Machsheva shaloi la'achlav bezrika b'chlal we don't care about. The only psul of shaloi la'achlav is only by shchita. Even by shchita, when is it possible? If you had it in mind to shecht it only for people that cannot eat it. In other words, the Mishnah is speaking about both scenarios, also avoda achas. And here again, and therefore what? Our Mishnah is not Rabbi Meir. Yeah, because according to Rav Meir, if you would have dual intents during one avoda, based on the rule of Tfais Lashon Nishain, when the first one was good, l'shmai u'shaloi l'shmai, indeed, according to Rav Meir, the Koren Pesach will be kosher. So is that pshat? So again, the Gemara says, midi idia, hakadisa v'hakadisa. The Seifa is clearly also add the words v'avoda achas, reisha either v'avoda achas or b'shtei avodos, and therefore the inquiry here is not resolved. Nor is the inquiry that we just quoted on Amud Aleph, whether you can be machashev me'avoida la'avoida, also not resolved, because we don't know how to learn pshat in the Mishnah, and that's it. That's the end of this topic. Okay. And now we're going into an amazing inquiry. And like we mentioned in the intro, that there's something unique, exceptional by the Koren Pesach. Machsheves shaloi l'shmoi by Pesach and by Chatos. But by Pesach, only on the 14th in the afternoon, invalidates the Korban. And ironically, a machsheves shaloi l'shmoi. If a person takes a Koren Pesach, we designated the Koren Pesach a couple of days ago, and for whatever reason it was brought in the Beis HaMikdash prior to its time. Same thing would be post its time. There was a Korban that was designated as a Pesach. Pesach passed. If the Kohen says, I'm shechting it l'shem shlamim, that Korban will be great as a shlamim. A machsheves shaloi l'shmoi by a Pesach, shaloi bezmanoi, makes the carbon kosher. Now, there are different ways of understanding it. We're going to get to this in the bottom of the Amid. There is a way of understanding it is that it's not because the Kohen said this is a shlamim that it makes the carbon kosher, because a shlamim can be brought the whole year. No. It's the fact that the Kohen had a machsheves shaloi l'shmoi on a Pesach. Machsheves shaloi l'shmoi on a Pesach uproots the carbon. Now, if you uproot the carbon during the time that the Pesach has to be brought, then it's possible. But when you uproot the Pesach designation in any other time, that's the best thing you could have done. And it's not because the Kohen said, I'm doing it for a shlamim. It's not the Kohen's declaration that makes it into a shlamim. All we need from the Kohen is we need for the Kohen to uproot it from it being a Pesach. And when he does that, since it's shaloi bezmana, it automatically becomes a shlamim.
What do you mean by uproot?
Uproot is simply by saying, I'm shechting this for something other than the Pesach. The example we're using is shlamim.
Thank you.
Since a Pesach, bismanoi, shaloi l'shmoi, is invalid because you ruined it. If you ruined the Pesach during the year, that's the best thing you could have done. Because once you took it away from it being a Pesach, automatically the Torah says a Pesach during the year becomes a shlamim. Now, listen to this, guys. Put on your thinking hat. And listen to this. And he had a dual intent. Mamish gavaldi. Lishmoi v'shaloi lishmoi. But appreciate, Pesach b'shari yemais hashana lishmoi is not good. The second intent, dual intent, shaloi lishmoi, is good. So he shechted it, let's say, on the 12th of Nisan or on the 13th of Nisan, and he says, I'm shechting this l'shem Pesach or l'shem shlamim. What will be the question here? Whether here, the second statement, the shaloi l'shmoi, could it rectify the carbon? Now, why would this be different than the case of the Mishnah? The Gemara explains. Mahu, do we say, mi asi, the second statement, shaloi l'shmoi, which again is good because it's b'shari yemais hashana. Uma piklei midei l'shmoi. It uproots it from. It changes its initial designation l'shmoi. And it takes hold, which is good. And therefore, umachshelei oiloi, which does the intention of shalei l'shmoi have the koyach to remove the psul. Now, again, you would ask, I don't understand why. Like in our Mishnah, when you bring the carbon Pesach on the right time and you have dual intent, we take both intentions in mind. But here, as we'll learn the Gemara, there is a logic to say that since it's not the time to bring the Pesach, the latter statement will be able, so to say, to rectify that which to begin with should not have happened, which is bringing a Pesach b'shari yemais hashana l'shem Pesach. And the Gemara goes on to say like this, that Kiyasi Ravdimi, when Ravdimi came from the Holy Land to Babel, this is what he said, that we had this boy, we knew about this question. And I want you to know that Amirita Lishmaitza Kamei Rav Yirmiyah, I shared in front of Rav Yirmiyah my response to the boy. And let me tell you what I told Rav Yirmiyah. I told Rav Yirmiyah that Hoyel Ulishmoi Machshiroi Bizmanoi and Ushaloi Lishmoi Machshiroi Shaloi Bizmanoi. So now let's be makish. Let's compare details of one to the other because it sounds like they're the same. Lishmoi Bizmanoi is good. Shaloi Lishmoi Shaloi Bizmanoi is good. So let's make the following correlation. Guys, halt up. Ma Lishmoi Hamachshiroi Bizmanoi. What's the rule that we learned in the Mishnah? Ein moitzioi midi shaloi lishmoi. That means that if a person on Erev Pesach first had a invalidating intent. What's the invalidating intent Erev Pesach? Shaloi lishmoi. Right, the second case of the Mishnah. The second case of the Mishnah of dual intent. Shaloi lishmoi ulishmoi. Does the latter statement rectify the first statement? The Mishnah said no. Even though the second machshava was good. So therefore, af shaloi lishmoi, which is hamachshiroi shaloi bismanoi. But what was the case of the boy? The case of the boy was, first it was lishmoi, which is the bad intent. And then it is shaloi lishmoi. Well, once you made a bad machshava, that's it. You're doomed. Ein moitziai midei lishmoi, and therefore apostle. Oh, I heard about the boya. Rav Dimi says, I told Rav Yirmiyah, why would it be different? If you have dual intent, especially if the first one is not good, the second intent doesn't have the koyach to rectify it. So then, so the Amar Li, Rav Yirmiyah explained, no, that's not a good comparison. Here, there's a reason, perhaps, to say that he didn't rectify it, and why? Why? Im amrat b'shaloi lishmai, which is the case on Erev Pesach, shaloi lishmai, ulishmai, shekei noyach b'chol hazvachim. A machsheva shaloi lishmai is a very negative machshava. And like we mentioned, the first Mishnah in Zvachim, even though Chatos and Pesach and machsheva shaloi lishmai completely invalidates it, but the truth is that by all other karbanos, even though the carbon is kosher, but it has a negative effect. Loi alu l'ba'alam l'chayva. If I have to bring a carbon shlamim, for whatever reason, whether it is an adava, whether I'm obligated, and the kohen says, I'm bringing this l'shem oila, I have to bring another shlamim. In other words, a machsheva shaloi l'shmai is a very powerful negative intent, which is why, in the case of our Mishnah, if the kohen first had machsheves shaloi l'shmai by the Pesach, it mamash invalidated it. It's a strong invalidator. So even though he had right afterwards another machshava, l'shmai, too late, you really messed it up, you can't fix it. But this irony that we're saying, that during the rest of the year, machsheves l'shmai invalidates the Pesach. That's a very unusual invalidator. That's only for the Pesach. It's an irony that by a Pesach, you dafka want the kohen to have a machsheves shaloi l'shmai. L'shmai ruins it. This shekein in a b'chol hazvachim al Pesach bovad. In other words, you can argue that the machsheves l'shmai, let's call this, it's a weak invalidator. So we're back to the inquiry. So if you begin by ruining it, but with a weak invalidator, l'shmai, maybe the next machshava, the shaloi l'shmai, should have the power to rectify something that was only weakly invalidated. Beautiful. So this is all just to clarify the base of the boya. So now, my hava Allah. So Amar Rava, says Rava, Pesach, sheshachate b'shari yemais hashana. Let's go back to our case, which is first he had a machsheves l'shmai, which is bad. Then he had a machsheves shaloi l'shmai, which is good. Says Rava, atazah, yes, the animal is kosher. Now, where did Rabbi get this from? Rabbi explains himself. As we learned in the beginning, Daf Beis and Zvachim, Daf Beis Amid Beis. This is a very important klal. After the Mishnah speaks about machsheves shinui kodesh, the Gemara says that if a kohen has stam machshava, that's good. A kohen doesn't have to declare every time he does a step on the avodah, like a shlamim, I'm shechting it l'shem shlamim, I'm mekabel. He doesn't have to do that. He has to do the avodah. The whole concept of a machshava that it could invalidate a cardamom is if he has a negative machshava. That means that instead of him just saying, I'm doing this l'shem avodah, if he says, I'm doing this l'shem one and it's really for the other, now you got yourself a problem. So stam is also l'shmai, says Rav. Let's go to the case of a carbon Pesach. If you have a carbon Pesach, when a person said this animal is for a carbon Pesach, whether it is an Erev Pesach, whether it is Shari Yemais Hashana, Stam, it's a Pesach. Nevertheless, so Stam is already a Pesach. Nevertheless, Ki Shachat Lei, Shaloi L'Shmai, whenever you shach the Pesach, Shaloi B'Zmanim, Shaloi B'Shari Yemais Hashana, if there's only one intent, Shaloi l'shmai, it's kosher. So what do you see, my friends? You see that a machsheves shaloi l'shmai has the power to uproot it from its presumed designation. Now, the premise of Rava's explanation is that Rava is comparing, Rava's making equal a presumed designation and a explicit designation. For Rava, it's the same thing. So, stam, it's already l'shmai. Shari Yemais Hashana, that's the irony of this rule. That's the exceptionality of this rule. That if a person brings a carbon that was designated for a Pesach b'Shari Yemais Hashana, as long as the kohen declares, I'm doing this shaloi l'shmai, it's good. If he would have said nothing, stam, l'shem Pesach. which means the shaloi l'shmai has the power to rectify it. It uproots its prior stomach. Alma also shaloi l'shmai ma'abel l'shmai. So Rabbi, who again was comparing a presumed designation with an explicit designation, is kishachet nami. Even if the Kohen said clearly, b'shari yemais hashana, his first declaration was not a good declaration, and that is the l'shmai, l'shem Pesach. As long as he added u shaloi l'shmai, asi shaloi l'shmai, u'ma piklei midei l'shmai. So Rabbi's response is based on a premise that a presumed designation is as powerful as an explicit designation, and this will be the reason to argue with Rava. So Amalei Rav Ada bar Rava nisht, no, leimet an aleph. Dilma shani heichad deloy amar, shani the amar. If he says lishmai, which is b'shari yemais hashana, a not good designation, but if he says it, he ruined it stronger. It's stronger. It's a stronger psul. Mehecha, you're bringing it from a case where the loy amar, where it's only presumed l'shmai. And here Rav Ada is going to prove that an explicit designation is stronger than a presumed designation. How will he prove it? Let's go to the case that we quoted from Daf Samach Aleph. La'oichlav u'shaloi la'oichlav, says the Mishnah, it's kosher. Now, hold on. If he only would have shechted it, that's the psul of shaloi la'achlav. We already learned to San Amud Aleph. If you have that intent during any other of the steps other than shechita, I don't care. If you have dual intent, you're good. But yes, if when you shecht it, the kohen is shechting it only for people that cannot eat it, it's possible. Now, the key of Rav Ada's proof, again, is that we presume that a Korban Pesach is designated for those who can eat it at least as well. It's stama for la'oichlav. Yet, here we're going in the opposite direction. Here we're going from something good to a latter statement that messes it up, which is fine. So the latter statement has the koyach to overpower a stam. Stam, right? La'oichlav. Stam, why would you think otherwise? A Korban Pesach is at least also for people that can eat it. Nevertheless, if a kohen shechts it and he says, shaloi la'achlav, so the shaloi la'achlav has the power to overturn a presumed designation. Elot must be shani heichad amar meheichad loyamar. No, it's stam la'achlav could be overturned if he says shaloi la'achlav. Now, what happens if the kohen is going to what? If the kohen is going to explicitly say that what? I'm doing it la'achlav u'shaloi la'achlav. The second statement, shaloi la'achlav, does not overturn the first statement. It's still kosher. Why not? Because the latter statement has the power to overturn stam, but the latter statement does not have the koyach to overturn something that was said explicitly, because something that's said explicitly is stronger. So the premise of Rava is not correct. Stam Pesach b'shari yemais hashana is l'shmai. Yet, if you make a second statement, it does overturn the prior presumed designation. But if the kohen says not Erev Pesach, b'shari yemais hashana, l'shmai v'shaloi l'shmai, maybe it's not good. Hachinami, shani heichad amar, which is worse, meheichad lo amar. So you, Rava, you have no proof. So Amar Lei, Rava tells Rav Ada, Midi Iria, I disagree with you. Bishleima Hassan, Kama deloi akarle b'shchita, Stame vade lishmoi koi. Over here, where I'm talking about bringing a Korban Pesach b'shari yemais hashana, yes, it's if you designate an animal for a Pesach, stama l'shem Pesach, you designate it for it. Stama is just like a explicit designation. Yet we find a rule that b'shari yemais hashana, if the kohen said at the end, if he says that this is shaloi l'shmoi, it's valid. Shaloi l'shmoi overturns a prior stama designation, and a stama designation is just as strong as a explicit designation. When it comes to shechting a Korban Pesach, we're saying that stama l'choira, stama is l'shem oichlav. And yet, if the Kohen says at the end that he's bringing it shaloi la'oichlav, right? There, the shaloi la'oichlav will make it possible. But if he says la'oichlav u'shaloi la'oichlav, it's going to be kosher. So says Rava, who told you that when you bring a carbon Pesach, we presume that it's being brought la'oichlav? It's an ishtamis. You have no idea who this animal is being brought for. Now, we're going to just quickly speak out that this whole concept of having a pre-registry, the pre-registry is not fixed in stone. That means if we decide Mashiach is coming, we're going to buy our chat, we're going to buy a lamb. We can say that until we're blue. As long as the animal was not shechted, we can change the designation. We can say that, no, we are removing ourselves. We're not part of the registry. Other people can be connected. In other words, there is no stam by a carbon Pesach. It's not stam ala oichlav. Elo hacha by oichlav, stam ala oichlav koi, says Rava. If stam ala oichlav koi, then you're right with your proof, but it's not true. Dilma mimashchi hani v'asachrini umamani yilave. As we learned the first white line, that nimnim, that you can be counted, you can register, and then you can change your mind. Umayshchin es yedem mimenu at sheyishchat. So therefore, Rava stands his ground that a presumed designation is just as powerful as a explicit designation. And since B'shari Yemois Hashana, when the Kohen says, I'm shechting it, Shaloi L'shmoi, he rectifies the carbon. So even if the Kohen said, I'm shechting it L'shem Pesach or L'shem Shlamim, the L'shem Shlamim, the second statement, has the power to rectify the first. Rava stands his ground. And let's begin with the Nubaya, that we spoke all this out on the intro. Now, Atkan, when we're speaking about Lishmoi, my friends, Halkop, we're speaking about Shinui Kodesh. Shinui Kodesh, change of holiness, means that the animal was designated for a Pesach. So Shaloi Lishmoi means that the Kohen is saying, I'm bringing it for L'shem any other carbon, a change of its Kodesh. There is another invalidating machshava called Shinui Ba'alim. Shinui Ba'alim means that if this carbon, a carbon shlamim, belongs to Reuven, if the Kohen says, I'm bringing this for Shimon, he messed up the carbon. Now the same thing, it's kosher, but Shaloi Alul Ba'alim, but by a carbon Pesach, it's completely invalidated. So now, says the Gemara, guys, in the middle or the end of the first wide line, Pesach, which let's continue with Rava. Stama lishmai. That means without any intent, it's worth nothing because it's got to be a Pesach. Another statement everyone agrees with. If the Kohen says when he brings the Pesach b'shari Yemais Hashana, I'm bringing it b'shinui kodesh l'shem shlamim, the carbon is good. The carbon is good. What happens if the Kohen did not make a Shinui Kodesh statement? He made a Shinui Ba'alim statement. B'Shinui Ba'alim, he didn't say he's bringing it L'Shem Shlamim. He didn't say anything. Stama is LaPesach. But he says, I'm bringing it for Shimon. Do we say Shinui Ba'alim should be like Shinui Kodesh? And therefore, Umachshir Lei Oiloi. And what we spoke out in the intro is the way that Bochanan explains the boya. Like what's the people, when they learn this, they don't understand. Why would you think that? Why would you think that just because he's shechting it for a Pesach, B'shari Yemais Hashana, that's not good? Just because he has in mind to shecht it for someone other than its owner, why would that be of benefit? The pshat is that whenever a Pesach is being brought B'shari Yemais Hashana, it's only going to be kosher if you uproot it from it being a Pesach. How do you uproot it from being a Pesach? By invalidating it. How do you invalidate it? Shinui Kodesh, Shinui Ba'alim. And maybe the pshat is the moment the Kohen invalidated its Pesach designation, then Hashem automatically imbues that carbon with the Kedusha of Hashlamim. And if that will be the case, then it will be good. Or not. So Amarav Papa, I want you to know, Amrisa Lishmaitza Kamed Rava. When I heard about this boya, I told Rava that Hoyel Vishinui Kodesh Poisloi Bismanoi, Vishinui Ba'alim Poisloi Bismanoi, these are two equally invalidating intentions. So therefore, let's make a corollary between them. That ma shinui kodesh. Shapois lei bezmanoi. Ironically, is machshiroi la'achar zmanoi, or it's really shaloi lizmanoi. That's the whole beauty. When you bring a carbon pesach not on the right time, shinui kodesh actually makes it good. So af shinui ba'olim, shapois lei bizmanoi, it invalidates the carbon. So once you invalidate the pesach b'shari yamais hashana, that's a good thing, because you uprooted its Pesach designation. So automatically Hashem puts in it the status of a shlamim. So machshiroi la'achar zmanoi. So this is what Rav Papa felt. Guys, we're going to stop over here. I know we're middle of the sugya, but we're going to see how Rava showed him that lav dafka, you can make this corollary for the reasons that we will continue learning. One thing is beautiful, B'chal, when it comes to Zvachim, when it comes to everything that we're learning, is something that Hasidus borrows a term of machshava moyelis. Just to know where it comes from. Machshava, like we mentioned in the intro, Rashi Tosfos says machshava doesn't even mean machshava. It means a verbalized machshava. Rambam holds just machshava. But in the context of the Mishnah and the Gemara, machshava moyelis is in the negative. That if you had an intent which doesn't align with the reality, you ruined it. And kachim is so delicate that it's sensitive, according to the Rambam, even to the machshava of the kohen. But now that we learn in the Torah how thought, especially according to the Rambam, has a power to affect something's status, so Hasidus borrows this term in the positive way, right? The trach gut vat zayin gut. The original story of trach gut vat zayin gut was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek who had a child that was very ill. And he went over and he told the Rebbe that by the laws of nature, his child would not survive. So the Tzemach Tzedek told him that now is the time that you should be machazik your bitachon and your emunah. And he told him the words machshava moyeles in the positive. Trach gut v'zayin gut. Because indeed, machshava is moyeles, and even better, let's add in Rashi and Tosfos that if a person has a good machshava, and on top of that they verbalize it, that's according to everyone is mat moyeles. That's the whole vart of the Alter Rebbe when he quoted from the Magid that what a Chassidish Fabrengen can accomplish, even Malach Mechol cannot accomplish. What's pshat? That if machshava is moyeles, for me, if I think good about a certain outcome, it's gonna affect the outcome for the better. Imagine if that's verbalized, and imagine if it's not only me thinking about something positive, but the whole group is thinking about something positive, which is what happens by a Fabrengen. You have a bunch of Eden, not one. For one moment, they're saying that yid should have a refuah shalema, that yid should have parnas, that yid should be blessed with the child. So you have many people thinking positive and Rashi Tosfos and saying words. Ooh, that's mamash moyeles l'teiva u'levracha. To be continued. Guys, enjoy it.
Shkayach.
That it's almost over.